because we're at the CCA, and you've raised the question already, and I've seen it in your work, but maybe we can talk about it a little bit, is where is architecture in your work? You're a lens-based artist, but you have a very strong relationship to the built environment. It features in your work, you encounter it, you think about it, and inevitably you develop some kind of relationship with it. And what I've seen in the work of all three of you is a deeply personal, sometimes, relationship of care also about various aspects of this built environment. So while we are here with you, can we talk about what that means? At the CCA, we like to say that architecture is a public concern. So this is also a great opportunity to hear from the public, from you, what those concerns are for you. Does any of you want to? I mean, you've talked so much about architecture.
Okay. I mean, for me, architecture is a case study in a way. That's how it appears in my work, obviously. What is interesting to me about architecture in a way is that it comes to kind of, it's both representational, but it also comes to shape the way that we live. What is interesting to me about the photographic document is that it does the exact same thing. It is both a representational tool, but also something that has the kind of power to actualize change, again, transposed through space and time.
Yeah, that's good. Jinyoung.
Yes, I think in a broader sense, because my main concern when I started making work as an artist was this notion of home, and also the idea of home in connection with the physicality of it, the physical construction and the location, geographic location, and the sense of place that comes with it. And the idea of sense of place is only possible if the place exists. And in a way, the places can disappear in many different ways. And I think in this kind of sort of like in my practice, I'm interested in like sort of capturing the or catching the last breath of the disappearing things, and like what my concern, I guess, on a personal level as well, and as an artist, is about to the architectural community is maybe to a certain degree, because this disappearance of places impact person in a very on the multiple layers and levels, that it kind of erase the ground of the experience and also sense of continuity as a person if you are a displaced subject. And I think this, to a certain degree, this idea of preservation of contemporary places are a very fleeting practice. I think it's like in an urban environment, especially, we always see see things are being erased and built up, and in a kind of very eradicating ways. And personally speaking, maybe the architects and the community of architects or the city planners even could stay maybe sensitive to this dimension of construction of places and buildings can actually resonate with people's experience on this kind of dimension, and that's the concern that I have with the topic of architecture in the work. Yes, thank you.
My observation, especially with the last photographs that you showed, with the close-ups of the assemblage, is actually they were very architectural to me. So in a way, you're becoming the architect of the ephemeral, and I could see similarities between sketches that we have in our collection of architecture students trying to assemble different shapes and forms and imagine them as buildings. So in a way, you are creating a space for imagination for spaces.
Oh, that's a really I don't know. I'm very touched to hear this response. Yes, I think well, working with the domestic objects is direct reference to the interior space, right? But like I would take them out into the public space and then building something solid out of that in itself, and it needs to be solid, and that's some of a contradictory status to be working with this kind of material. But yeah, it kind of builds like an imaginary architectural structure in viewer's mind. That's what I would hope.
I think it works.
Thank you. That's great to hear.
Marisa, what do you want to add?
Well, I think the idea of home is something that's very prevalent in my work in general. I mean, architecture is everywhere. It's found all around us as we navigate and live in an urban environment. But for me, where architecture was found in my work recently, because it's usually not found in my work, but is through the archives. It was through the archives that I was able to understand the architectural and geographical makeup of a place that was home for my family. And then through that archive, I could also see the disappearance of that architecture. So you talk about building and destroying and disappearing and existing. So the oscillation of those things were things that I was very aware of when I was creating the work. And in terms of the archive, for me, it was the golden key that allowed me to understand, you know, the architectural makeup of what people considered home.
Yes, I think this element of the temporality is strong in the work of all three of you also, but
Yeah.
It reminded me of the workshop we had yesterday here at the CCA with Ange Loft, a Mohawk artist based in Toronto who had a workshop with staff. And she touched on the question why there were so few homes that were found from the Mohawk community or the other people who had lived here. And she said her father reminded her that the houses they built were often built with organic materials, and they were not built for eternity in the way that our society is building, and that there was something good in that after 15 years having a small village on one location, it sort of grew out of its confines, and everybody could just pack up their things, maybe even bring some building materials along with them, and then settle down on another spot that was good, where there was water, there was wood. And it was very interesting that she sort of unsettled this notion that architecture needs to be so permanent. And at the same time, we're trying to preserve, as we see these temples, that then you can't access, so you can't really use them. So there's this tension between time and temporality of spaces in all of your work. Is that something you can comment on? Could you imagine like having a city that would move every 15 years?
The whole city. Or the city that I can contain. Maybe. I don't know how to imagine. I guess it's just if I can define what a city can be for the immediate community that concerns me, then perhaps we could be more mobile, and geographic location is not as I guess, that could also mean like we are taking into consideration of like unexpected, like a natural factors like climate. But then if it can be contained, that I can pack up things or I can move around with the infrastructure that are mobile enough, then maybe sense of place can happen in another places.
Yes, I mean, you touch on the climate change, and I think that is a very relevant question also that architects are dealing with, which might mean that our dwellings could necessarily have to be built in a more temporary way. You've lived across different continents in your life, and is that something that, I mean, how would you relate to this notion of temporality? Would it have been a loss for you or not?
I think to me, and I was thinking about it when Jin was responding already. There is, I think, when I think of architecture and movement, I instantly think of people like Paul Virilio, and I think of this idea of how, like, kind of the contemporary condition of the working class is this kind of extreme acceleration that has to do, like, globalization is just a movement of acceleration in a way. And I think to me that appears in my family. And when I think about it, then sometimes in making jokes, with my mother, we say that we're a family in acceleration because basically, you know, my mother comes from a country, she's lived in another where I was born, and then she's moved to another one. My brother also lives in a different country. My other brother is a touring sound technician, or a video technician, so he actually doesn't really have a fixed base. So in a way, we're all kind of like very scattered, and the more time passes, the faster and faster all of us move. I mean, obviously everything, again, it's about a point of reference, but everything has movement. But I think there's also another sense of movement in architecture that is, we often forget about, that it's like, yes, architecture houses a lot of places to stay, but it also houses a lot of places for transit and for connection, and for kind of like, you know, the street and the river are somehow very similar things. So again, as Jin was saying, because from conditions like the climate or many different reasons, even just, I mean, at this point, kind of like this, again, thinking of Virilio, this kind of possibility of like teleaction of, you know, this inertia where you're like sitting at home on a computer and the way you're thinking is kind of going around the world multiple times in a minute. So I think in a way, and to me that is also architecture, like this kind of like bridging spaces, the way we use digital tools, you know, Google Maps, or even things like dating apps in a certain way, are this kind of like transparent architectures that effectively change the way a city is perceived. Like the park is not the same park before and after the invention of the car, for example. The distance is you know, as we accelerate, as technology develops, kind of architecture changes this relationship to space too. So
I would say the park is also not the same after dating apps. To continue talking about displacement, because this area is about displacement, and displacement is often regarded as a word having a negative connotation. Yet in all your work, I see also this positive power that it can lend to a photographer's gaze and the care with which you attend to this displacement. And what has been the most productive element of your engagement with this topic for you as a photographer, and maybe also in your personal life? What experience have you gained from paying such specific attention that you could share with others?
Well, for me, it was about resurrecting a place that was forgotten through oral history. And it was forgotten not by the people that lived there, to be quite, you know, clear about that, but by, you know, the people in the city. And it's not only that it was forgotten, but a lot of people didn't know about it. And they didn't know about it because it was buried after, you know, after the neighborhood was destroyed. Public records disappeared. And it took the valiant efforts of an archivist who felt that these records were so important to bring it back to life. And it took, you know, the efforts of people that felt a need to bring it into a museum and have a show about it that also brought it back to life. So those were the elements that helped me work through how to memorialize and to bring this back into a public conversation. It's not just the Goose Village. It's many places are destroyed and disappear, and you know, we see it with so many hallmark events in the world, and I think that that's what makes it so urgent to photograph. You know, the photograph remains, the book remains. And so that history is cemented. But if none of those things happen and places disappear, they disappear forever.
I think one of the things that I realized as a person and as an artist while working on these projects was perhaps the importance of the material existence. I'm such an analog person in this way, but I think the idea of like disappearing places is very scary to me in many ways, because because as a person who's, you know, living far away from where I formed my, I guess, early identity, or, you know, formation of a person was done like in the early sort of teenage years, if you can say that, then those memories can be brought up, or I can go into the process of recollection only if there's a reference to it. And if there's no reference to it, it's really hard for our brain to pick it up and, like, you know, have this memories relived again. So in that sense, this realization was very important for me, that what offers the sense of continuity in a person's, or in my life, I cannot speak for others, is the existence of recognizable places, and this continuation of the attachments to those important personal spaces or places. And in that way, I want to go back to your earlier question, maybe very briefly, about this mobility that we can actually. This is another future that everyone is dreaming of, considering the environmental impact of, like, you know, the construction itself, or waste that's being generated. But if it cannot happen with the sense of place factored in, I think that's a very dystopian future. So I was like, with my partner, I sort of imagined this world where everything is subscription, where the furniture, all the objects we can have, the physical object can be subscribed, and you don't actually own anything. So in a sense, in theoretical, you know, hypothetically, that's very good for an environment, because we would just reuse everything. But at the same time, if the person doesn't own anything, it means, to me, it's like you cannot go back and live the full life somehow. So I don't know. I think that realization to me was very big. Yes.
I have a question here.
Yeah, me with the microphone. I have a question as well. You know, all of you are lovely practicing artists with experience and ties to displacement, but not all the artists or authors that are in the CCA collection and abroad have the same sensibility to the subject. So how can we reflect on the images that are produced that are useful for us today, but were taken perhaps with a colonial gaze, and then going forward in the future, how can those perhaps without that kind of experience still contribute to the narratives?
Well, Pedro, of course, has made good use of some of the historical photographs in our collection, and I'm glad that he sort of came along and actualized them, or activated their potential. So maybe you can start with a possible answer to that.
Yeah, I'm kind of smirking, because as we were looking through some of the photo albums, I guess I won't say names, but Hester and I were looking at a very specific photographer that we were like, why is the camera not straight? Like, why is this blurry? Why, like, what is the, and we it didn't seem like it was some kind of like maneuver, some sort of like artistic kind of decision, especially taking into account that it was like the end of the 19th century. And eventually, kind of, Hester did some research afterwards and found out that effectively the person that was documenting that was quote unquote not really a photographer, but just someone who had the wealth at the time to like travel there and kind of had the money to operate and to buy an instrument like a photographic camera and operate it, which is not the case today. I think looking back, I'm not sure where I stand in how much room we have for, let's say, remediation or rectification of what already is done. I think if there is something to be done, there is kind of obviously always stemming from the people that are affected many times by those views, and kind of Sister was saying, like I think it's a pretty, maybe not a trend, but something very characteristic of the time that we live in is how there's a lot of artists that are, again, working with archives and this idea of, and I think that's where personal histories, that's why your question was linked, but I think it's precisely the personal histories that are necessary for this kind of, I don't want to say remediation or rectification, but maybe reframing of the materials that are there. Moving forward, I think in a way the challenge is quite the opposite, is that again, the rate at which we produce images has accelerated immensely, and so has kind of the access to photographic tools. That is obvious, right? Like if we think of a city like Montreal, if we think about the decade of the 60s, we could probably do a census of photographers of who had the money to buy a Hasselblad camera or something like this. Whereas today, kind of there's a crisis in photojournalism and like photo documentary, because the first person to always be somewhere is someone holding a smartphone. I think that question, if we think about it, again, in the past, it's about kind of reactivating. If we think about it moving forward, this what gets archived by who and in what means, in the sense that when we think about things like algorithms or things like this, it's really not my topic, so I won't like dip my feet in too much there, but I think it's a valuable question to be posed right now. It's kind of where if there was this kind of very clear dynamic of class before on image production, I think now it has to do maybe with other things like attention economy and other kind of like factors and cultural, social capital, aesthetic capital that determine what gets archived or what gets picked up or ignored in a certain way. Yeah, I think that's kind of as much as I can say about that.
For me, I think it's a collective effort. Like, I don't think it's one person's responsibility. I think that, it takes an archivist to preserve, it takes a photographer to take the picture, it takes a writer to write about it, it takes an historian to trace, it literally takes a collective effort. I don't want to say village, but I kind of feel like saying it. But it does, So I don't think the responsibility lies in it for one person. But I think it's something that we need to maintain as a philosophy, as a culture, as a society, that things do need to be preserved in ways that are not just algorithms and digitally, but find other ways to do it as well.
I do agree with Marisa's take on it, that it is also, I imagine that it is a very slow process. I think it has started, and it has started, and then stages of different sort of considerations of structural sort of changes of the society and institutional sort of structural changes. And the education, I think we are all teachers, and educations of the younger generations also contribute really hugely. And in that case, I think it's also responsibility of the educational institution to be mandating sort of this kind of various different diverse viewpoints and productions.
I think that was very interesting also for you to share not only your work, but also how you work, how you build your projects. So that was like these processes and the methodology and your way of thinking, and not only sharing like your final images, but all of the processes. That's very, very interesting. Also, that kind of enrich also the way we understand your work. So thank you very much for that, and thank you also for. I had a question, but you have all already like answered like, on the role of photography, and each of you have like a kind of a different also answer to it. So that's very nice. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amélie.